Defying the odds, moments of military genius. History remembers the victories that should never have happened. On a frozen morning in 218 BCE, Hannibal Barca stood at the foot of the Alps, watching his war elephants lumber through snow for the first time in history. His officers thought him mad. His enemies thought him dead. Rome slept soundly, believing their empire protected by nature's greatest barrier. They were all wrong. This is a book about the moments when the impossible became inevitable, when commanders looked at overwhelming odds and saw opportunity instead of defeat. It's about the thin line between military genius and outright insanity, and the rare individuals who knew exactly which side of that line they stood on. Consider Caesar, who built a wall around his army to defend against a fortress, then built another wall around that wall to defend against a relief force, effectively besieging himself. Or young Alexander, who scattered his forces before the largest army ever assembled, deliberately opening a hole in his lines to create a trap that would swallow an empire whole. These aren't just tales of victory against the odds. Any determined army can get lucky. These are stories of commanders who saw possibilities their enemies couldn't imagine, who turned their opponents' greatest strengths into fatal weaknesses. They're about the moments when conventional wisdom died on the battlefield, and military science was rewritten by those bold enough to break its rules. In each of these 5 battles, disaster loomed so close that we can still feel its shadow across the centuries. A few feet of mud at Agincourt, a morning's fog at Austerlitz, a single hesitation at Gaugamela, history hung by these threads. Yet in each case, what looked like desperation to observers was all part of a brilliant, if audacious, plan. This is not a book about warfare. It's a book about vision, about seeing paths to victory that don't exist until someone is bold enough to forge them. It's about the kind of genius that borders on madness, the kind that changes not just battles, but the course of civilization itself. These are the victories that echo through time. These are the battles that remind us, sometimes the only way to make history is to defy it. Let us begin with a young king who looked at the greatest empire the world had ever known and saw not an invincible force, but a giant waiting to fall. The genius of Alexander at Gaugamela. Dawn broke over the plains of Gaugamela with the screams of elephants. Darius III, king of kings and ruler of the largest empire the world had ever seen, had spent weeks preparing this battlefield. His scouts had leveled the ground to perfect flatness, ensuring his scythe-wheeled chariots could maneuver at full speed. Before him stood the greatest army ever assembled, 250,000 men drawn from 40 nations, from Indian mahouts atop their war elephants to Scythian horse archers who could shoot backwards at full gallop. Persian immortals gleamed in gold-scaled armor. The very earth trembled beneath the stamping feet of cavalry from 3 continents. Across the plain, a young man with mismatched eyes studied this overwhelming force through the pre-dawn gloom. Alexander of Macedon, not yet 30, commanded barely 47,000 men. This should have been the moment doubt crept in. Instead, he smiled. "Look at them," he told Parmenion, his eldest general. "They've made the ground perfect for our phalanx." Darius had indeed smoothed the battlefield, not knowing he'd just given Alexander's unique infantry formation the exact conditions it needed to perform its deadly dance. The Persian king had prepared the ground for his own destruction. This was Alexander's genius, seeing opportunity where others saw only overwhelming odds. He'd spent the night studying the terrain, noting how Darius had anchored his flanks, watching the Persian cavalry arrangements. Where others saw an unbeatable force, Alexander saw joints he could strike, gaps he could exploit, and most importantly, a Persian king who expected the Macedonians to behave like every other army he'd crushed. But Alexander never fought like anyone else. As the sun climbed higher, Darius watched in confusion as the Macedonian army began an odd, oblique march to the right. It seemed to make no sense until Alexander's true plan revealed itself in a series of movements so perfectly timed they still stand as a masterpiece of military deception. The Macedonian right wing stretched further and further, threatening to move beyond the carefully prepared ground. Darius, fearing Alexander would escape to rougher terrain, ordered his left wing to attack. Exactly as Alexander had predicted. The massive Persian cavalry charge opened a gap in their lines, a gap that would prove fatal. What followed was perhaps the most audacious cavalry charge in military history. Alexander, leading his companion cavalry, drove like a spear toward Darius himself. The Persian arrays parted before this lightning thrust, their very numbers working against them as confusion spread through the ranks. Alexander had turned the Persian army's greatest strength, its size, into a critical weakness. Darius, watching this golden-armored figure charge directly at his position, made the same mistake his father had made at Issus. He ran. The sight of their king fleeing broke Persian morale. The largest army ever assembled began to disintegrate. But the battle wasn't over. On the Macedonian left, Parmenion faced annihilation as Persian cavalry threatened to roll up Alexander's entire line. Any other commander would have been trapped between these forces. Alexander, in the heat of pursuit, made a decision that showcases why tactical genius can never be reduced to simple rules. He wheeled his cavalry around, abandoning the pursuit of Darius to crash into the rear of the Persian forces, threatening his left wing. The timing had to be perfect. A few minutes too late and his army would be destroyed. A few minutes too early and Darius might rally his forces. Alexander threaded this needle with devastating precision. By sunset, the impossible had happened. The greatest empire of the ancient world had been broken by a force less than a fifth its size. Alexander had not just won a battle, he had demonstrated a new kind of warfare where speed, timing, and tactical flexibility could overcome seemingly insurmountable odds. Darius's carefully smoothed battlefield became a graveyard for an empire. Alexander, standing amid the aftermath, was no longer just the king of Macedon. He had proven himself the greatest commander of his age, perhaps of any age. But more importantly, he had shown that the impossible was merely the unlikely in disguise. The Persian Empire, which had seemed eternal, collapsed in the wake of this single, perfect battle. Alexander would march on to India, becoming a legend in his own lifetime. But it was here, on the plains of Gaugamela, that he earned his title the Great, not through overwhelming force, but through the audacity to see victory where others saw only certain defeat. 23 centuries later, military academies still study the Battle of Gaugamela, not just for its tactics, but for its vital lesson. Sometimes the greatest obstacle to victory is believing it impossible. Hannibal's audacious Alpine crossing. The first elephant died on the third day of the ascent. It was October 218 BCE, and Hannibal Barca was attempting something no one had ever dared, leading an army complete with 36 war elephants across the highest mountain range in Western Europe. The Romans, masters of military intelligence, hadn't even bothered posting guards in the Alps. Such a crossing was deemed impossible. Watching his men push the fallen elephant's carcass off a cliff to clear the narrow path, Hannibal understood exactly why. The air at this altitude was so thin, his African troops could barely breathe. Ice formed on spear points. The path ahead twisted up through clouds, narrow enough in places that a single misstep meant death. But Hannibal hadn't come to turn back. Since childhood, he'd been bred for one purpose: Rome's destruction. His father, Hamilcar, had made him swear a blood oath to never be a friend to Rome. Now, at 29, he had devised a plan so bold it seemed like madness: strike Rome from the north, through the Alps, from the direction they least expected. The local Gallic tribes watched in disbelief as this strange army wound its way up the mountainside. Spanish cavalry, Numidian horsemen, Balearic slingers, and those incredible elephants, a force as diverse as Carthage's trading empire itself. Many of the tribes attacked, rolling boulders down on the columns, striking at night. Hannibal's response showcased why he would become Rome's greatest nightmare. He turned the mountain itself into a weapon. When a massive rockfall blocked his path, Hannibal ordered great fires built against the stone. As the rocks heated, he had his men pour wine from their rations over them. The rapid temperature change shattered the boulder into pieces his men could clear. This same ingenuity would later reshape warfare in Italy. But first, they had to survive the descent. The northern side of the Alps proved even more treacherous than the ascent. The path disappeared entirely at points, requiring Hannibal's engineers to carve a road into the sheer mountainside. The ice here was treacherous. Men and animals alike slipped to their deaths. In one 3-day stretch, they advanced less than 2 miles. Yet Hannibal's greatest achievement wasn't just crossing the Alps, it was keeping his army's fighting spirit alive. He showed his men the fertile plains of Italy below, promising them not just plunder, but farms of their own in this rich land. He shared every hardship, sleeping on the same frozen ground, eating the same meager rations. When his men's morale wavered, he reminded them they were making history. After 15 days in the mountains, Hannibal's army descended into Italy. The cost had been staggering. Of the 102,000 men and 37 elephants that began the crossing, only 26,000 men and a handful of elephants survived. The Romans, hearing of his arrival, dismissed this reduced force as a ragged band of survivors, too weak to threaten their republic. They were wrong. What emerged from the Alps was not a broken army, but a force tempered by impossible challenges, led by a commander who had proven he could achieve the unthinkable. These veterans, hardened by their ordeal, would go on to shatter 3 Roman armies in succession. At Trebia, Lake Trasimene, and most famously at Cannae, Hannibal would prove that his crossing of the Alps was not just an act of desperation, it was the beginning of a new kind of warfare, where bold strategy and rapid movement could overcome any obstacle. For 16 years, he would remain undefeated on Italian soil, bringing Rome closer to destruction than any other commander in history. The Republic would eventually survive, but it would never be the same. Hannibal had shown that Rome's greatest defense, the Alps themselves, could be overcome by sufficient daring. Today, archaeologists still find Carthaginian coins in Alpine passes, silent testimony to one of history's most audacious gambles. But Hannibal's true legacy isn't found in artifacts. It lives in the enduring lesson he taught. The greatest victories often require gambling everything on a single bold stroke. The Romans would eventually label him the father of strategy. But first, they had to survive his masterpiece, the day African elephants walked through snow, and the impossible became merely difficult. The Siege of Alesia, Caesar's double wall strategy. When Julius Caesar ordered his legions to build a wall around Alesia, his enemies laughed. When he ordered a second wall built around his army, they thought him mad. They didn't laugh for long. September 52 BCE, the fate of Gaul hung in the balance. Inside Alesia's formidable hill fort sat Vercingetorix, the charismatic leader who had united the Gallic tribes against Rome. With him were 80,000 warriors and the hopes of a free Gaul. Outside, Caesar's 50,000 legionaries faced a nightmare scenario, besieging a fortress while expecting a massive relief army at their backs. Any other general would have retreated. Caesar instead conceived a solution so audacious it defied military logic. He would build not one siege wall, but 2. The inner wall would trap Vercingetorix. The outer would stop the coming relief army. His own forces would fight caught between them. The scale of construction beggared belief. The inner wall stretched 11 miles, studded with towers every 80 feet. The outer wall, 13 miles long, transformed the besiegers into the besieged. 23 forts, more than 250 artillery towers, all built in just 6 weeks. But it was the details that showcased Caesar's genius. Before the walls, he ordered ditches dug. The inner filled with water from diverted streams, the outer studded with sharpened stakes. Fields of ankle-breaking lily pads, sharp stakes hidden in pits, covered the approaches. Lines of stimuli, barbed spikes hammered into the ground, waited to catch charging warriors. This wasn't just a wall. It was the most sophisticated defensive system ever devised. The Gauls watched in growing horror as these fortifications rose. Vercingetorix, running low on supplies, made his first gambit. He sent away his cavalry, 15,000 strong, to rally every warrior in Gaul. The message was simple: come now or Alesia falls. They came. 250,000 Gallic warriors, the greatest army ever assembled in Western Europe, descended on Caesar's position. The Roman general found himself in a position military historians still debate, defending against 330,000 enemies with just 50,000 men. The battle that followed became a masterclass in crisis management. When the relief army struck from the west, Caesar was dining at his command post. He arrived at the critical sector to find his men wavering. Without hesitation, he stripped off his crimson general's cloak and charged into the front line, fighting as a common soldier. His men rallied. But the real test came at midnight. Vercingetorix, timing his move perfectly, launched a major sortie while the relief army struck again. In the darkness, lit by burning artillery shots, Caesar's army faced attacks from both sides. The walls that made his position strong now threatened to become a trap. Caesar's response proved why he would eventually master Rome itself. Racing through the darkness between his fortifications, he orchestrated a defense that seemed to put him everywhere at once. When his Germanic cavalry ran out of javelins, they charged with drawn swords, routing the Gallic horse. When a section of wall was breached, Caesar led the counterattack personally. The final act came at dawn. The relief army, marshalling for one last effort, struck Caesar's weakest point. At the same moment, Vercingetorix launched his remaining forces in desperate coordination. Caesar, his reserves almost exhausted, made the kind of decision that separates good generals from legends. He led a cavalry charge out through his own walls, sweeping behind the relief army just as they committed to their attack. Caught between this charge and the Roman fortifications, the Gallic army broke. The rout became a slaughter. Inside Alesia, watching his last hope die, Vercingetorix made his final move. He surrendered personally to spare his men, riding out alone to Caesar's position in full ceremonial armor. The man who had nearly broken Rome's power threw his weapons at Caesar's feet in a gesture that would be remembered for millennia. The double wall of Alesia marked the end of Free Gaul and the birth of Roman Gaul. More importantly, it showcased a truth about military genius. Sometimes the boldest defense is to accept encirclement, turning vulnerability into impregnable strength. Today, standing on Mont au Roi, where Alesia once stood, you can still trace the outlines of Caesar's walls in the French soil. They remind us that sometimes the greatest victories come not from overwhelming force, but from the courage to embrace an impossible position and the genius to make it unbeatable. The strategic genius of Agincourt. Rain hammered the French knights' armor like vengeful spirits. October 25, 1415. 6,000 English soldiers, starving, dysenteric, exhausted from weeks of marching, faced an army 4 times their size. The flower of French nobility had come to teach the English king a lesson about warfare. They would learn one instead. Henry V stood in the pre-dawn gloom, his gold crown affixed to his battle helmet, glinting dully in the rain. The 28-year-old king had led his army deep into French territory on what seemed a fool's errand. Now, trapped between the towns of Agincourt and Tramecourt, his men faced annihilation. But Henry had chosen this ground with a warrior's eye. The battlefield, a recently plowed field between 2 forests, funneled directly into his position. The French, to reach him, would have to cross terrain turned to mud by 3 days of relentless rain. Their greatest advantage, heavily armored cavalry, was about to become their undoing. The French commander, Marshal Boucicaut, had arranged his forces in 3 massive battles, the medieval term for army divisions. Thousands of mounted knights formed the vanguard, their armor polished to mirror shine despite the weather. Behind them waited line after line of men-at-arms, crossbowmen, and yet more knights. Victory seemed certain. Then Henry unveiled the weapon that would change warfare forever, the English longbow. His archers, common-born men who had trained since childhood with bows taller than themselves, could loose arrows that would puncture plate armor at 200 yards. Each carried 2 quivers holding 24 arrows. Simple mathematics suggested the French faced nearly 60,000 arrows in the opening minutes. But it was Henry's positioning that turned a powerful weapon into an unstoppable one. He placed sharpened stakes before his archers, angled toward the French cavalry. Any charge would impale itself on this forest of wood. The French waited for hours, expecting the English to attack. Henry didn't move. Finally, around 11 a.m., the French commander made the decision that would doom his army. The cavalry charged. What followed was chaos transformed into butchery by tactical genius. The rain-soaked field turned to mud under thousands of hooves. Horses slipped. Knights, weighed down by 60 pounds of armor, struggled to maintain formation. Then the arrows began to fall. Modern historians estimate English archers could lose 10 to 12 arrows per minute. 6,000 arrows every few seconds darkened the sky. Horses screamed, riders fell. The French charge collapsed into the mud. But Henry's true genius revealed itself in what happened next. As the French vanguard reeled back in chaos, they slammed into their own advancing infantry. Arrows continued to fall. Men and horses thrashed in the mud. The French army's huge numerical advantage had become a death trap. There were too many soldiers crowded into too small a space. Knights who survived the arrow storm found themselves unable to rise after falling. Their own infantry, pressed forward by the mass of men behind them, trampled the fallen. French nobles suffocated in their own armor, pressed into the mud by the weight of their collapsing army. Then Henry ordered his lightly armored infantry forward. They moved through their own stakes, carrying war hammers and daggers designed to puncture armor. What followed was intimate, brutal work. The English specifically targeted French nobles, knowing their ransom value. The slaughter grew so complete that Henry, fearing a last-minute rally, ordered the execution of his noble prisoners, an act that violated every code of chivalric warfare. Only when a French cavalry attack on his baggage train proved false did he rescind the order. By day's end, the flower of French nobility lay dead in the mud. Estimates suggest over 6,000 French nobles and knights died, compared to just hundreds of English losses. Among the dead were 3 dukes, 8 counts, a marshal, an archbishop, and over 100 lords. Shakespeare would later immortalize this battle, putting words in Henry's mouth about "we few, we happy few, we band of brothers." But Henry's actual speech that morning was reportedly briefer, more pragmatic. "Fellows, let every man do his duty today and remember that Englishmen have always won their battles against the French." Agincourt changed warfare forever. It proved that common-born archers could destroy noble cavalry. It demonstrated how terrain could multiply the effectiveness of a smaller force. Most importantly, it showed that the age of knights charging across open fields was ending, replaced by something more democratic and deadly. Today, the battlefield is a peaceful farmer's field again. But archaeologists still find arrowheads in the soil, silent testament to the day when 6,000 starving men defeated an army of knights through a perfect combination of technology, terrain, and tactical genius. The mastery of Austerlitz, Napoleon's strategic genius. "One sharp blow and the war is over," Napoleon told his marshals on the eve of December 1st, 1805. They looked at him with doubt in their eyes. Their emperor had just deliberately weakened his right flank, abandoned the high ground, and invited 85,000 Russians and Austrians to outflank his position. To everyone except Napoleon, it looked like madness. The next morning would become legend, the Battle of Austerlitz, or as Napoleon would later call it, the finest of all I have fought. But its true genius lay in the days before, in a piece of psychological warfare so subtle that military historians still debate whether Napoleon's opponents fell into his trap or were meticulously maneuvered into it. For weeks, he had played the part of a desperate man. He ordered conspicuous evacuations of supplies. He positioned his troops to appear scattered and vulnerable. He even abandoned the Pratzen Heights, commanding terrain that dominated the battlefield, while making the movement appear reluctant, almost panicked. His enemies watched these movements with growing excitement. Tsar Alexander Beymer of Russia and Emperor Francis II of Austria, commanding their combined armies personally, saw exactly what Napoleon wanted them to see: a French army overextended, its commander finally making mistakes. The Allied plan practically wrote itself. They would strike Napoleon's weakened right flank, cut his line of retreat to Vienna, and crush his army against the frozen lakes to the south. It was textbook military strategy. It was also exactly what Napoleon had spent weeks orchestrating. Dawn on December 2nd brought a thick fog rolling across the battlefield. The Allies began their movement south, weakening their center to strengthen the force striking at Napoleon's right. Through the mist, they could dimly see French units falling back in apparent disorder. Then the sun rose. History remembers it as the Sun of Austerlitz, a brilliant winter dawn that burned away the fog just as the Allied army had committed to their flanking maneuver. As the mist cleared, the true magnitude of Napoleon's trap revealed itself. The Pratzen Heights, which the Allies had left virtually undefended in their eagerness to outflank Napoleon, now faced Marshal Soult's corps advancing in full strength. Napoleon had hidden 24,000 men in a fold of ground, positioning them perfectly to strike through the Allies' now weakened center. "How long will it take you to occupy the heights?" Napoleon asked Soult. "Less than 20 minutes, sire." "Then let us wait another quarter hour." This patience, letting the Allies commit even more fully to their doomed flanking maneuver, showcases Napoleon's mastery of battlefield psychology. When he finally gave the order, Soult's men stormed up the Pratzen Heights against light opposition. The Allied army had been cut in two. What followed was a masterpiece of tactical coordination. As the Allies realized their peril and tried to recall troops from their flanking maneuver, Napoleon's entire army seemed to pivot around the Pratzen Heights like a great door swinging shut. French forces that had appeared scattered suddenly moved with perfect synchronization. The Allied army's right wing, separated from its center, found itself pushed back against the frozen lakes of Sachan and Menitz. Under French artillery fire, the ice began to crack. Entire Russian units plunged through, their heavy equipment dragging them down. For years afterward, local fishermen would find weapons and bones in their nets. By early afternoon, the battle that would cement Napoleon's reputation as history's greatest commander was effectively over. The Allies had lost 15,000 dead or wounded, with another 11,000 captured. French losses numbered less than 8,000. But Austerlitz's real significance lay not in the casualties, but in its perfection. Napoleon had deliberately shown his enemies exactly what they wanted to see, tempting them into a trap so subtle they walked into it believing it was their own idea. The battle combined strategic deception, tactical brilliance, and psychological manipulation into a single devastating package. The morning after the battle, Napoleon rode across the field as the sun rose again through the winter mist. He stopped at a plateau where the fighting had been fiercest. "One lives twice," he told his staff, "when one can enjoy tomorrow the victory of today." Austerlitz marked the peak of Napoleon's military genius. The French Empire would grow larger, but it would never again achieve such a perfect victory. The battle became a testament to what's possible when strategy, deception, and execution align perfectly, when a commander can see not just where the pieces are on the board, but how his enemies' minds will move them. 2 centuries later, doing in Austerlitz remains military shorthand for winning through cunning rather than brute force. The battle reminds us that sometimes the greatest victory comes not from being stronger than your enemy, but from being able to see deeper into the nature of warfare itself. The anatomy of audacity. Victories through psychological insight. When history holds its breath. History's greatest victories share an invisible architecture. Standing on the plains of Gaugamela, walking the Alpine passes, tracing Caesar's walls at Alesia, crossing the muddy fields of Agincourt, or watching the sun rise over Austerlitz, you feel it. That electric moment when everything hung in the balance. When history held its breath. These battles, separated by centuries and continents, reveal patterns that transcend time and technology. Each commander faced what looked like certain defeat. Each found victory not through overwhelming force, but through a deeper understanding of warfare's psychological dimension. Alexander saw that Darius's greatest strength, his enormous army, could become a catastrophic weakness if thrown into confusion. Hannibal understood that Rome's mental map of what was possible had a massive blind spot above the Alps. Caesar realized that being surrounded could become an advantage if you built the right walls. Henry V grasped that heavy armor's psychological advantage could transform into a death trap in the right terrain. Napoleon demonstrated that an enemy's strategic assumptions could become a weapon more powerful than any artillery. But the genius of these victories goes deeper than tactics or strategy. These commanders shared a particular kind of courage, not the bravery to face death, but the audacity to imagine victory when everyone else saw defeat. They possessed what the ancient Greeks called metis, a cunning intelligence that sees opportunity in disaster. Modern neuroscience suggests our brains are wired to follow patterns, to see what we expect to see. Military genius often involves the ability to break free from these patterns, to imagine possibilities that seem to defy military logic. Each of these victories required their commanders to think beyond the conventional wisdom of their era. Yet none of these victories were acts of reckless gambling. Each involved meticulous preparation disguised as improvisation. Alexander spent years developing the flexible tactics that would let him exploit gaps in enemy lines. Hannibal's Alpine crossing required months of diplomatic preparation with Gallic tribes. Caesar's walls at Alesia represented engineering genius as much as tactical brilliance. Henry V's archers had trained since childhood. Napoleon's desperate maneuvers at Austerlitz were orchestrated like movements in a symphony. This is perhaps the deepest lesson these battles teach us. True military genius lies not in defying the odds, but in changing them. Each of these commanders transformed the battlefield until victory became, if not inevitable, at least possible. They understood that the greatest battle is fought in the mind, both your enemies and your own. Today's military academies still study these battles, not as historical curiosities, but as masterclasses in the art of the possible. In an age of drone warfare and cyber attacks, the psychological insights of these commanders remain surprisingly relevant. Whether you're commanding tanks or managing a corporate takeover, the principles remain the same. Understand your enemy's assumptions, turn their strengths into weaknesses, and most importantly, dare to imagine victory when others see only defeat. The technology of warfare changes. The geography of courage does not. Standing on these ancient battlefields today, you can still feel echoes of those moments when history hung in the balance. When Alexander's cavalry thundered toward Darius's position, when Hannibal's elephants crossed the snow, when Caesar's walls rose around Alesia, when Henry's arrows darkened the sky, when Napoleon's sun burned away the fog of war. These were moments when audacity met opportunity, when boldness bordered on madness, when the impossible became inevitable. They remind us that history's greatest victories often come not from following the rules of warfare, but from having the courage to reimagine them entirely. In the end, these battles teach us something profound about human achievement itself. The most important limits we face are often not physical, but mental. The greatest victories come when we dare to look at the impossible and ask not why, but why not?